Let's start by addressing the instinct that most people get completely wrong when they're dealing with an avoidant partner. The urge to chase. It feels natural, almost automatic. When someone pulls away, your mind interprets it as loss and your body reacts with urgency. You want to close the gap, fix the distance, and restore connection as quickly as possible. But here's the paradox. The very behavior that feels like love to you often feels like pressure to an avoidant. Avoidant individuals are not indifferent. They are internally wired to associate closeness with a potential loss of autonomy. So when you chase, when you text more, call more, try harder, you're unintentionally confirming their deepest fear. That intimacy will consume them. And the moment that fear is activated, they don't lean in, they retreat. Now, this is where emotional intelligence becomes power. Because instead of reacting impulsively, you begin to respond strategically. You recognize that attraction is not built through pursuit. It's built through presence, self-possession, and emotional stability. When you stop chasing, you're not withdrawing love. You're refining it. You're shifting from neediness to grounded confidence. Think about it this way. People are drawn to what feels complete, not what feels desperate. When your energy says, I need you to feel okay, it creates pressure. But when your energy says, I value you, but I'm already whole, it creates curiosity. And curiosity is the beginning of attraction. This doesn't mean you become cold or distant. It means you become centered. You invest in your own growth, your own routines, your own sense of purpose. You build a life that doesn't revolve around their responses. And ironically, that's what makes them start to notice you more. Because now, instead of feeling like they're being pulled into something overwhelming, they're being invited into something stable. There's also a deeper psychological shift happening here. When you stop chasing, you give the avoidant partner something they rarely experience: space without guilt. Most people punish distance with emotional reactions, but when you allow space without tension, it disrupts their expectations. It creates a new pattern, one where closeness doesn't feel like a trap, but a choice. And human beings value what they choose, not what they're forced into. So instead of asking, how do I get them to come closer? You start asking a more powerful question. How do I become someone they naturally want to come closer to? That shift changes everything, because now your focus is not on controlling their behavior. It's on elevating your presence. You become calmer in your communication, more intentional with your time, less reactive to distance. And over time, that consistency builds a new emotional environment, one where they feel safe enough to lower their guard. This is not about manipulation. It's about alignment. You're aligning your behavior with how attraction and human psychology actually work. You're respecting the reality that connection cannot be forced. It has to be invited. And here's the truth most people don't want to hear. Chasing might give you temporary closeness, but it erodes long-term desire. Attraction grows in space, in mystery, in the freedom to move towards someone, not away from them. So if you truly want to melt an avoidant's heart, you don't run after them. You rise into a version of yourself that they feel drawn to without pressure. Because the moment you stop chasing is the moment they finally get the space to start choosing you. Now, once you understand the power of stepping back and no longer chasing, the next level of connection requires something even more nuanced, creating emotional safety without creating pressure. And this is where most relationships either deepen or quietly fall apart. Because here's the truth. An avoidant partner is not resisting love. They're resisting the feeling of losing control within love. To them, emotional intensity can feel overwhelming, not because they don't care, but because they haven't learned how to stay grounded inside it. So when emotions come at them too fast, too strong, or too unpredictably, their instinct is not to engage, it's to shut down. And if you misinterpret that shutdown as rejection, you'll respond in a way that reinforces the cycle. Emotional safety begins with understanding that your partner's nervous system is constantly scanning for one question. Am I about to be overwhelmed? If the answer feels like yes, even subconsciously, they withdraw to protect themselves So your role, if you want to reach them, is not to intensify the emotional experience, but to stabilize it. That means you communicate in a way that is grounded, not reactive. You express how you feel without turning it into an emotional demand. There's a difference between saying, I feel disconnected and I'd love to spend some time together, and saying, why are you always distant? Don't you even care about me? One invites connection. The other triggers the fawn. You see, pressure doesn't always come from what you say. It comes from how it feels to the other person. Even well-intentioned love can feel suffocating if it carries urgency, expectation, or emotional weight that they're not ready to hold. This is where discipline comes in, because it takes emotional strength to stay calm when you feel uncertain. It takes awareness to slow down your reactions when your instinct is to push for clarity. But when you do that, something powerful happens. You become a regulated presence in their life. And people don't open up to intensity. They open up to stability. Creating safety also means letting go of the need to control the timing of their vulnerability. Avoidants often open up in small, unexpected moments. Not in the middle of a heavy conversation, but in a quiet pause, a shared experience, or a moment where they don't feel watched or evaluated. If you rush that process, you interrupt it. But if you allow it, you expand it. There's also a philosophical layer to this. Real connection is not built by forcing someone to meet your emotional pace. It's built by meeting them where they are without abandoning yourself in the process. That balance between patience and self-respect is what creates trust. Because trust for an avoidant is not built through words. It's built through repeated experiences of not feeling pressured, judged, or emotionally cornered. So instead of trying to break through their walls, you become someone who doesn't trigger the need for those walls in the first place. Your presence says, you can be here as you are, and nothing will be forced out of you. And over time, that message becomes something they start to believe. And when a person feels safe, truly safe, their natural state is not to withdraw, it's to connect. So the question is no longer, how do I get them to open up? The question becomes, how do I create an environment where opening up feels safe enough to happen naturally? Because when safety replaces pressure, resistance fades. And when resistance fades, the heart has no reason left to stay closed. And that's when connection stops being something you fight for and becomes something that finally begins to flow. Once you begin to create emotional safety instead of pressure, you're ready to understand one of the most misunderstood dynamics in any relationship with an avoidant partner, their need for space. And this is where many people sabotage something that could have grown into something meaningful. Because when an avoidant pulls back, most people don't see space. They see rejection. They personalize it. They internalize it. And almost instantly, the mind starts creating stories. I'm not enough. They're losing interest. Something is wrong. And from that emotional state, the reaction is predictable. You try to close the gap. But here's the reality you have to train yourself to see clearly. For an avoidant, space is not the opposite of love. It's how they regulate themselves within it. You have to understand that their internal experience of closeness can become overwhelming, not because the connection is wrong, but because their capacity to process it is limited. So when they step back, they're not necessarily stepping away from you. They're stepping back into themselves to regain balance. Now, if you respond to that space with anxiety, with pressure, with constant attempts to reconnect, what you're actually doing is interrupting their regulation process. You're turning their need for balance into a source of stress, and over time, they begin to associate the relationship not with comfort, but with emotional overload. Respecting space is not passive. It's an active form of emotional intelligence. It requires you to manage your own internal reactions instead of projecting them outward. It means you don't chase reassurance every time there's silence. You don't demand explanations for every shift in energy. You allow the moment to exist without trying to control it. And that's not easy because it forces you to confront your own attachment patterns. It forces you to sit with uncertainty without immediately trying to resolve it. But that's where growth happens, not just for the relationship, but for you as an individual. When you genuinely respect their need for space, something subtle but powerful begins to shift. They stop feeling like they have to escape in order to breathe. They begin to experience you not as someone who takes from their energy, but as someone who protects it. And that changes the emotional equation entirely, because now, instead of associating closeness with pressure, they begin to associate it with peace. And human beings naturally move toward what feels peaceful. There's also a deeper layer here. Respecting space is a form of trust. It communicates without words. I trust you to come back. I trust the connection without needing to control it. And that kind of trust is disarming, especially for someone who is used to relationships feeling conditional or demanding. But let's be clear, respecting space does not mean abandoning yourself. It doesn't mean tolerating neglect or accepting inconsistency without boundaries. It means you give space from a place of strength, not fear. You maintain your standards. You stay grounded in your own life. You don't pause your world waiting for them to return, because the moment your life becomes smaller to accommodate their distance, you lose the very energy that attracted them in the first place. So you hold a balance. You give space, but you don't disappear. You stay present, but not intrusive. You remain open, but not dependent. And in that balance, something begins to happen naturally. The distance that once felt threatening becomes part of a rhythm. They move away, and then without pressure, they begin to move back. Not because they have to, but because they want to. And that's the shift you're aiming for, from forced connection to chosen connection. Because when someone feels free in your presence, they don't run from you. They return to you. And the moment they start returning on their own is the moment you know their heart is no longer guarded. It's opening. By the time you've learned to stop chasing, to create safety, and to respect space, you're operating from a very different level of awareness. But there's another layer that determines whether the connection deepens or quietly collapses. And that is how you communicate when it actually matters. Because communication is not just about honesty. It's about delivery, timing, and emotional weight. And when you're dealing with an avoidant partner, those three factors become everything. Most people believe that the key to a healthy relationship is expressing everything they feel, exactly as they feel it in the moment they feel it. And while that might sound authentic, in practice, it often creates emotional flooding, especially for someone who already struggles with intensity. An avoidant doesn't resist communication. They resist feeling overwhelmed by it. So when conversations come loaded with urgency, accusation, or emotional pressure, they don't experience it as connection. They experience it as something they need to escape. And the more intense the delivery, the faster they shut down. This is where you separate emotional reaction from intentional communication. Instead of speaking from the peak of your emotions, you learn to speak from clarity. You take a moment to process before you express. UA. Scale yourself. What is the outcome I actually want from this conversation? Because if the goal is connection, then the method has to support that goal. There's a fundamental difference between emotional dumping and meaningful communication. Emotional dumping says, here's everything I'm feeling, deal with it. Meaningful communication says, here's what matters, and I'm sharing it in a way you can actually receive. And that shift changes how your words land. You become more precise, less reactive. You remove unnecessary intensity and focus on what truly needs to be said. Instead of overwhelming them with a flood of emotion, you offer them something structured, something grounded, something they can engage with without feeling like they're losing control. Timing also becomes critical. Not every moment is the right moment for a deep conversation. If they're already stressed, distracted, or emotionally distant, pushing for depth in that moment will only create resistance. But when you learn to recognize when they're more open, when they're relaxed, present, and receptive, you increase the likelihood that your message will actually be heard. And then there's tone. Tone communicates more than words ever will. You can say the right thing in the wrong way and still create distance. But when your tone is calm, steady, and non-threatening, it signals safety. It tells them this is not a confrontation. This is a conversation. This doesn't mean you suppress your needs. It means you express them in a way that invites dialogue instead of triggering defag. Because at the end of the day, communication is not about proving a point. It's about creating understanding. There's also a deeper discipline here. You're learning to regulate your own emotional state before trying to influence theirs. You're not outsourcing your stability to their response. You're bringing stability into the interaction itself. And that's powerful, because when someone feels like they can talk to you without being overwhelmed, judged, or emotionally cornered, they begin to lower their guard. Conversations become less about defend and more about connection. And over time, something shifts. The person who once avoided depth begins to engage with it because it no longer feels like a threat. So instead of asking, how do I get them to communicate more? You begin asking, how do I communicate in a way that makes them want to stay in the conversation? Because when your words feel safe to receive, silence no longer feels like their only option. And when silence is no longer their escape, communication becomes the bridge that finally brings you closer. When you've reached this point where you're no longer chasing, where you've learned to create safety, respect space, and communicate with intention, you begin to embody something far more powerful than strategy. You become an emotional experience. And that experience determines whether an avoidant partner continues to guard their heart or slowly begins to open it. Because at the deepest level, people don't stay in relationships because of words. They stay because of how they feel in your presence. And this is where the real transformation happens. You stop trying to manage the relationship from the outside and you start shaping it from the inside through the energy you bring into every interaction. You become consistent, calm, and grounded, not perfect, not passive, but emotionally steady in a way that feels rare. Avoidant individuals are highly sensitive to emotional environments, even if they don't express it openly. They are constantly assessing, often unconsciously, whether being close to someone will cost them their peace. So if your presence feels unpredictable, critical, or emotionally demanding, they instinctively keep their guard up. But when your presence feels stable, when there's no sudden pressure, no hidden agenda, no emotional volatility, they begin to relax. And that relaxation is the doorway to connection. Being their safe place doesn't mean you agree with everything or suppress your own needs. It means you create an atmosphere where honesty doesn't feel dangerous, where they can show up as they are without immediately feeling judged, corrected, or overwhelmed. And that requires a high level of self-mastery, because you have to regulate your own emotions before you try to influence theirs. You have to let go of the need to win every disagreement, to prove every point, to fix every distance immediately. Instead, you focus on maintaining a connection that feels respectful, even in moments of tension. You become someone who listens fully before responding, someone who doesn't escalate conflict unnecessarily, someone who can hold space for discomfort without turning it into drama. And over time, this creates something incredibly powerful: emotional trust. Not the kind of trust that's built on promises, but the kind that's built on repeated experiences. They begin to realize, when I'm around this person, I don't feel drained. I don't feel pressured. I don't feel like I have to defend myself. And when that realization sets in, their behavior starts to change. Not because you ask them to, but because they want to stay connected to that feeling. There's also a philosophical truth at play here. Human beings are drawn to environments that allow them to be both free and accepted at the same time. Most relationships fail because they lean too far in one direction, either too controlling or too distant. But when you become a safe place, you hold both. You offer closeness without control, presence without pressure. And that balance is what makes someone feel at home with you. But let's be clear, this is not about losing yourself in the process. Being a safe place doesn't mean tolerating disrespect or ignoring your boundaries. In fact, it's the opposite. True safety includes clarity. It includes knowing what you will and won't accept and communicating that without aggression or fear. Because safety is not built on weakness, it's built on strength that is expressed calmly. So you stand firm in who you are while still creating space for them to be who they are. And in that dynamic, something rare begins to emerge, a connection that feels both secure and asdraid. And when an avoidant partner experiences that kind of connection, something shifts internally. The walls they built for protection no longer feel necessary. The distance they once needed begins to shrink, not because you forced it, but because you made it safe for them to choose differently. And that's the ultimate shift. You're no longer trying to open their heart. You become the kind of presence their heart naturally opens to. Because in the end, people don't open up when they're pushed. They open up when they feel safe enough to finally stop holding back. And when you become that place of safety, you don't just touch their heart. You become the reason it finally feels at peace. And when you step B, act and look at everything we've talked about, a deeper pattern begins to emerge. This was never really about fixing an avoidant partner. It was about elevating the way you show up in connection itself. You stop chasing, and in doing so, you replace desperation with self-respect. You created emotional safety instead of pressure, allowing connection to feel inviting instead of overwhelming. You respected space, not as rejection, but as part of a rhythm that actually sustains intimacy. You learned to communicate with clarity and intention rather than emotional overload. And ultimately, you became a presence that feels calm, grounded, and safe to be around. And here's the truth that ties it all together. When you change the emotional environment, you change the relationship. Because an avoidant heart does not open through force. It opens through consistency, through patience, through repeated experiences of not feeling trapped, judged, or overwhelmed. And when that environment is present long enough, something powerful happens. Their defenses stop feeling necessary. But this is the part most people overlook. You didn't just create that environment for them. You created it within yourself. You became more stable, more self-aware, less reactive, more intentional. And those qualities don't just transform one relationship, they transform every interaction in your life. So whether this person fully meets you at your level or not, you don't lose. Because you've stepped into a version of yourself that no longer operates from fear or need, but from clarity and strength. And ironically, that's the version of you that people, avoidant or not, are naturally drawn to. So if there's one thing to carry forward, it's this. Real connection doesn't come from chasing someone's heart. It comes from becoming someone's whose presence feels like home.